So I went and saw Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs the other day, the new 2025 version, and it definitely hasn't got a lot of popular reviews going so far. But it made me get an interesting thought about general ways in which we structure our society, mainly from the difference between the protagonists and the antagonists of Snow White versus the Evil Queen. Snow White, on one hand, really stands for the virtuous person, the person that does the right thing, the kind thing, no matter what, no matter at what cost, always going to be nice, sweet, fair, justice, um, and fairness, no matter what you do. And on the other hand, you have the Evil Queen, who is completely selfish, self centered, always looking out for her best interest, maintaining power, and so on and so forth. And it reminded me of a conversation that my girlfriend had with her brother the other day. And at the conversation, they were discussing politics, and things got heated. Sometimes they do. And he called her a moralist, which was an interesting turn of phrase for me. Because on one hand, being called a moralist is basically like being said, it's bad to be a good person. And that kind of got me thinking that there's really a distinction in our head between doing the smart thing or the intelligent thing, or the wise thing versus doing the right thing, the good thing, the moral thing. And you might ask yourself, obviously, right? Like obviously, the right thing and the moral thing are two totally and separate things. But I would like to argue that's not always the case. I think there's certain cultures in history that have very different thoughts about this, and this isn't as obvious as a thing. Let's look at an example like World War II Japan. I was actually watching this very interesting speech by Sarah Payne the other day, and one thing she started talking about is the honor system that kind of fuels the philosophy of World War II Japan. And I'm going to play this video in a second, but basically one thing she kind of distincts is that in war, one of the most useful time to have complete and total knowledge about your subject, you have the Japanese people who will have a very lack of an analytical approach, and instead the moral thing is the right thing. Maintaining your honor, maintaining your standing is super important. And here's a clip from that video.
During times of peace, when listening to stories of battle, we should never say, in facing such a situation, what would a person do? Well, so much for my job at the Naval War College. So much for the case studies. No matter what the circumstances might be, one should be of the mind to win. One should be holding the first spear to strike. So here's the implications if you believe this. What you're doing, it's a very unanalytical way to approach wars. It's all about whatever it is you want, you just steal the will and go for it, and somehow you'll get it if you want.
And you might just go and say, all right, that's fine. That's Japan. That's one culture. I would suggest y'all also go ahead and view this whole piece. It's a brilliant conversation about some of the cultural analysis of Japan, and it kind of fuels some of the ideas that I'm going to speak about later. But if you want an example maybe a little bit closer to home, let's look at this. Let's look at the Bible. Something that's very, very influential on Western thought, but very much disagrees with this idea of the differences between doing what's right versus doing what's moral. Let's look at King Solomon, one of the famous wise guy of the Bible. If you know any stories about him, you probably know about the story about him trying to cut a baby in half. But we're not going to talk about that today. We're here to talk about that one of his statements is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. Kind of making a point that righteousness is the fundamental basisness of making good, sound decisions. And if you think this is just an Old Testament thing, and you're wrong. You have James here, who most scholars believe is the brother of Jesus. And he says, who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambitions in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder in every vile practice. So kind of the implications coming from that, hey, this isn't real wisdom. If you think you're being clever and you're just trying to look out for yourself, that's kind of not right. And it's going to lead you down a bad path. Wisdom and being moral are intertwined. So let's go back to this. We have a common sense kind of approach in America, and we also have a moral approach kind of in America. But here's my thought is actually this is not one moral system, but it's two. You don't have a common sense and you don't have a virtue. You have one moral system and you have another moral system. I think let's give an example here about how we can notice like that these things are moral systems is the phrase what ought I do. It's kind of a good frame of thinking about like value systems in general. And sometimes when you're looking at different value systems, you can examine certain phrases and see where they land and a certain impact. You ought to use a stapler, right? That's a very useful statement for someone who is trying to like organize papers, but less of a useful statement for someone who's trying to look about face decorations. However, unless you're maybe me when I was 3 and maybe wrestled around a little too much and busted your head open. But regardless, now let's look at this. What ought I do as an American? I think that's a good question. And I think here we have two answers here. So one, we have this. We have the common sense approach. This is the first value system, where it's like doing things that let you live a safe and comfortable life. And from here, we can see the values of the American dream is highly based on working on securing your family and your future. Having a strong police and safety in your communities is very centered on this common sense approach. Having very safe assets and in financial sectors and saving for your retirement is a very common sense approach. And also maybe even having Walmart on your home street, having everything in one place is very common sense, very convenient for you. Versus the right thing to do, which is I think is our second big moral system in America. It's doing things that are kind and equitable, even if they're painful or difficult to do. And let's look at this. You have examples like democracy. Like we want to protect democracy. We have this strong sense of patriotism as our country, and we also want to. The Black Lives Matter movement was an example of this. Improving empathetic listening skills, the Stop Bullying movement. These are all examples of trying to do the right thing. So let's now get to maybe my main point of conversation, which is politics. And I kind of want to separate the two parties into these two systems, and I wanted to do that with a story. So when I was around 10 or 11, I was at a sports game with my uncle and my cousin. And my uncle said to me, "It's really cold out, Tanner. You should share a blanket with your cousin." He was probably 4 years younger than me. And I looked at him and I said, "Well, no, that's what Democrats do." I was taking a common sense approach instead of the righteous or the right way to do things approach, which leads me here. Republicans very much believe in the common sense mentality. They are the party currently that represents this idea. Make America Great Again is a philosophy not necessarily about moral statements. Most people, if you ask them on the street, as much as the popular right likes to take that and make it mean attacking gay people and attacking trans people, I think the majority of people are trying to look back to the 50s, back to the 90s, back to the 80s, to a more prosperous America. And their fights on immigration are kind of pushing up that as well. And on the other side, you have the Democratic Party, which very much a lot of their big focus items are focused on the January 6th movement attacks. And those protests kind of really are trying to focus on this isn't right. This isn't the right way you have protests. This isn't attacking your democracy is bad. And also ending the violence in Gaza, which is also a very, very good thing to do. But it doesn't really like make you safer necessarily, at least in the short term, by ending this attack on Gaza. It's the right thing to do. It's the moral thing. So I now want to make an argument that for politics, in most of our history and currently, common sense is more important than doing the right thing. I don't think this is always correct, but like to win political elections, you have to be the party of common sense. All right, and let's start by looking back at history. Right, we have the Revolutionary War. Some might argue that liberty and justice and virtue is kind of the reasons why we originally started the Civil War. But if you dig deeper, it's because we were just upset about taxes. We were upset about how a monopoly on tea was handed down to the colonies, and the crown said, "You're going to take this or else." And we're upset about it. We are angry. We are not this perfect, beautiful country that we like to envision. But we are just a bunch of angry industrialists trying to make and set our way of life. Let's look at the Civil War. A lot of people want to believe that the reason why the North tried to fight for the South was because of the issue of slavery, which it definitely does become more and later in the war once the North sees the horrors in the South. But a lot of it was originally because the North wanted to preserve the Union instead of protect slavery. Look at the Civil Rights Movement. While the Civil Rights protests were highly effective, they weren't as effective, probably wouldn't have been as effective if the United States wasn't trying to win the war against communism. And you have to clean out your own backyard if you want to kind of prove yourself as the moral high ground in the country. It was the common sense thing to do at the time. And now let's look at modern politics here. I would argue that Donald Trump lost 2020 election because he botched the initial response to COVID. Bob Woodward said that COVID-19 was deadly stuff, and Trump played it down in February once he kind of already knew about it. Joe Biden, he lost the presidency because the country was going with inflation, and he became the not common sense president anymore. He kept on letting prices rise and rise, and so much so that, like, even with his mental decline, it was obvious that he didn't have the mental facilities to really do this. Next, you have Bernie Sanders, the most popular politician in America, and while he does have strong moral values, that's not near as important as the fact that he is a common sense man. He wants to lower the price of housing and lower the price of medical care, because everyone in America knows in a very basic way that it is obvious, it is good for your safety and your comfort if those two things can have their prices lowered. Maybe once you implement them, they become less common sense. But right now, like, when you look at the current status in the country, you're like, oh, I can't afford healthcare. One bad injury will send me to a life of poverty. And now let's look at where we're at now. So Donald Trump has been making tons and tons of different policy decisions going forward. And I just would like to say, I think ideas are the most useful when they can help you predict the future. And so I want to set up the scenario that we're in right now. So imagine that there's things that are just only not righteous, but also don't make common sense. And what's going to happen to your country and your support when you start attacking those things? Things like ending certain Medicaid for certain Americans, ending veterans care, and cutting Social Security checks. When these things start happening, you're not going to be the common sense party anymore. And guess what? You're going to start having backlash, as we are already starting to see. And I believe that's going to continue happening. And so here's what I think the Democrats should do going forward. I think you have to become the common sense party. You have to be based on the idea about effectively giving Americans more comfort and more safety in their lives, and that this is more important than necessarily doing the right thing. The ends are more important than necessarily going through the perfect path. You have to build more housing. You have to get Medicaid for more Americans. You have to attack my personal vendetta of big tech. Make big tech work for people so people are less miserable. Another pet theory I have is ambulances should be free. So that way more people can get care, and the more people see you working for folks, the better things are going to be. And I want to end with this example. At the end of Snow White, the evil queen gives Snow White a glass dagger, and this glass dagger is she puts it in front of her chest and says, "Snow White, kill me. If you really are want to make a change in the world, strike me down right now." And this girl behind me kind of screams and says, "Stab her." So what Democrats really need to do, in my opinion, going forward, is they need to be willing, on top of just saying all these things and saying they're willing to fight, is to actually do the act. You have to be a little bit more vicious. You have to be a little bit more practical in all these things to make your point going forward. And I think it's just really interesting about that we have these kind of two competing moral systems in America. And I think a lot of times we don't want to recognize that one of them is a moral system. It's how we kind of live our lives and dedicate it. Because it's embarrassing to say that I'm a selfish person. It's embarrassing to say that I look out for me before I look out for other people. And it's a hard pill to swallow. But if we can't identify that this is the nature of America, we're not going to win elections. And thank you for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe, and leave all interesting and contemplative comments down below. And bye.